Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. I think it's an important hearing to discuss the role of the federal government in education. There is a consensus across the parties in Congress, the President and Secretary Duncan, that the federal role in education needs to be reevaluated. And I think we can all agree that any federal involvement in our schools needs to work for the best interest of the students. I want to start with a story about one of the best days of my career, which was right after the school performance was reported in the local newspapers under the requirements of No Child Left Behind. These requirements gave parents an insight into what was happening in their local school and being able to compare it to the school down the block and across the city and across the greater East Bay of San Francisco area. They not only saw their AYP results compared to other schools, they saw it disaggregated about children like their children, English learners, minority children, poor children. But they also saw something else. They saw that their school didn't have very many highly qualified teachers, something we think is an anachronism today. But remember the struggle simply to get that definition into this law. So they wanted to know why they didn't have them. At that time, my state had 60,000 teachers in the classrooms who were on a temporary emergency credential, and some of them had been on the classroom on that credential that's good for 1 year, 5, 6, and 7 years, hiding out in poor and minority schools where nobody would ask whether or not they were qualified to teach or assess what they were doing. That was a great moment in my career because those parents now had information and it started a revolution in that district. And I think that that's what we have to understand, that there's a purpose to some of this. I join the chairman as he talks about regulations that can absolutely drive you crazy here as somebody who's involved in the writing of that policy to see what happens. And let's not pretend like it's only the federal government. I once had a contest with Chairman Boehner, or Speaker Boehner now, was chairman of this committee, with Harold Levy, who was the head of the New York schools at that time, about where the real burden came from. He texted all of his principals and asked them, was it the federal government or what? And they said, no, it's your office. It's everything you send us every day, asking us to fill out forms and requirements. So this is not just a problem at the federal government. But I also want to talk about what we've learned by having these kinds of various types of reporting requirements. Prior to the law, to No Child Left Behind, only 11 states had access to data that showed gender or ethnicity. Only 6 states had data about the achievement of poor students. Only 7 states were able to see data about the achievement of students based on English proficiency. These students were invisible. They were struggling in classrooms across the country, but nobody knew it. Their parents didn't know it, school officials didn't know it, the community didn't know it. And so nobody was able to fix it or to address the needs of these students. We passed No Child Left Behind to tackle this very harsh reality. We meant what the title said. No longer would it be okay to let a child fall behind because we didn't know how they were doing in school. Schools had to be accountable for all of their students. Today, parents, nonprofits, charter schools are all responding to the students' needs demonstrated by this newly found data. The law implemented a system of reporting and accountability to ensure that all students are being held to the same high standards and to compare students' achievement across schools, districts, and states. These new requirements allowed us to move the system forward. They allowed us to have a conversation today about how to reevaluate the federal role without losing sight of what we got right for students, parents, and communities in NCLB. We have all learned what we got right. We also have learned about what we got wrong. We learned there's a lot more we need to do to better support states and districts to improve the system and, most importantly, to improve the outcomes for students. There has to be more coherence in the system. This means setting strong goals, maintaining strong and meaningful accountability, and giving states and districts the support and the flexibility to reach those goals and to meet the needs of students. We need to fund programs in a way that allows districts to maximize the funding and meet the unique needs of their students and community. We also need to recognize the critical role of data to guide programs and measure the performance. Strong use of data is what allows the federal government to get out of the way while maintaining the integrity of these programs. Strong, reliable data lets teachers, parents, administrators, and communities take responsibility for the design and the accountability for outcomes in a performance-based system. Similar principles apply to how we approach regulation and accountability in higher education arena, where we have a duty to protect the integrity of billions of dollars in federal taxpayer dollars. We also know, however, that the outcomes we ask for drive practice. We need to be mindful about those outcomes that are supporting the goals and accountability systems we set. Let us remember, too, that we all have that we have all of this conversations and questions what is right and what, throughout this conversation, we have to ask the question, what is right and what is burdensome in the system? But first we must ask, what is in the best interest of the students? Without that framework, we have lost sight of the true purpose. I look forward to this hearing, and thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for inviting our witnesses to testify and enlighten us on this subject.